Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Midwestern Marxist show with Eddie Liger and Carlos Garrido. That's the name that ChatGPT gave me, so that's what you're getting for now, the Midwestern Marxist. If anyone has any better suggestions for show names, please leave them in the chat today. Well, we've got a great show for you planned today. I'm excited that I could hop on with Carlos and didn't have to do this stream solo. We're going to be talking about Tucker Carlson's take that's going viral, having to do with AI and self-driving trucks. Talk about the Marxist analysis or Marxist position on artificial intelligence and automation in general. We will talk about the war in Ukraine, of course, a little bit. Got some new clips and updates coming out of there. And we'll discuss another viral sort of history, political commentary video called Why Americans Are So Obsessed with Communism that I've been wanting to react to for a while. Sort of a liberal video that's critical of the U.S. position in the Cold War, but doesn't go far enough in criticizing the U.S. So that'll be interesting. And if we have time, I also have a video called Top 10 Revolutions That Changed the World. So a lot of interesting stuff today. I don't know if we'll get through it all, but we'll do as much as we can right after the intro. Tweeting out the link right now. How's it going, Carlos?
It's going well. I saw someone mention that we were late. They said 15 minutes. It's actually around 8 minutes, and I think that's the earliest we've ever started in terms of the ratio of when we actually start and when we say we're going to start. I've mandated that we always start on Cuban time, which means at the very least, 15 to 20 minutes late. When I used to play baseball in South Florida, especially for the Sunday semi-pro leagues, they used to give the time that you had to be there 30 minutes early, just so that if they get 30 minutes late, which is what was expected, they would be there on time. Yeah, how are you doing, brother?
Good. That reminds me of the saying, maybe it's a saying outside of wrestling, but I always used to hear it in wrestling. If you're on time, you're late. You got to be like 15 minutes early to everything. But I actually have an excuse today. I was StreamYard wasn't letting me schedule the stream for a certain time. It was being glitchy. So apologies to everybody, but we are here now, ready to break down the news for you in some theory. I've been reading Capital Volume 2 all day. Once you get through the part about the reproduction schemas, and once you kind of get in your head which department is which, because what Marx does is break down the capitalist economy into two departments. Department 1 produces the means of production, and Department 2 produces the means of subsistence. And he looks at how, value is exchanged between these two departments. It can be really confusing and tedious at first, but once you get, the hang of it, kind of get a feel for the argument, it's really enlightening. It's not quite as fun to read as Volume 1 because it's more purely scientific, as Engels says, but there's still so much to learn from it, especially I studied a lot of economics in college, a lot of bourgeois economics. And Volume 2, even more so than Volume 1, really breaks down and deconstructs the sphere of circulation, and the sphere of exchange, which is what bourgeois economics sort of hyper focuses on, hyper fixates on. They kind of just ignore production. Um, so it debunks a lot of bourgeois economic myths, and he also deconstructs the work of Adam Smith and others, which is really interesting. So yeah, that's what I've been reading.
Right, and that's so important that to remember that he's always bouncing off a critique of bourgeois classical political economy. Um, and most of the most important texts in our Marxist au revoir come from that sort of bouncing off project, that critique of something that already was produced. You have Anti-Düring, of course, a critique of Düring's revolution in the sciences. You have Ludwig Feuerbach, which is a critique of Stark's book on Ludwig Feuerbach. So many of them. And the 59 book, which ends up being like a sort of dress rehearsal for Capital, a contribution to the critique of political economy. Like even in the title itself, you have critique of political economy. And that's so important to notice. But yeah, I think that we were talking about it before the stream. Like the brilliance of Marx is just, it's kind of unmatched, the level of scientific rigor that is manifested in his work. And it's unfortunate that he was never able to finish it. You would think that since there's a volume 2 and 3 that was edited and published, that towards the end of his life, what he was working on is finishing volumes 2 and 3. But he was actually going back and continuously rereading volume 1 and continuously editing volume 1. He was working on a third German edition of volume 1. And when the French edition of volume 1 was published, the person that translated it messed up so bad that Marx ended up translating quite a bit of it and fixing it. And in the process of translating, he adjusted some things and some of the ways that things were being presented. But his his aim was always not just scientific rigor and the ability to reproduce the concrete concretely, but also to have a method of presentation that, while being dialectical and showing the sort of ascension from the most abstract to the most concrete categories, to also have the language that it was done through be lucid and be clear for people. It was supposed to be like, Capital wasn't ever meant to be just something for specialists or for the intellectuals in a party. It was supposed to be for the working class. So clearness was always one of the things that he wanted the book to be. And part of the revision of volume 1 was not just to update what he saw around him, but also to be more clear.
Yeah, you kind of notice that like Marx always wanted to make things available to the workers and break them down as simply as possible. And I believe he was commissioned to write Wage, Labor, and Capital or turn it into a pamphlet, but he did that, in Value, Price, and Profit, really, which is just, him trying to condense Capital, at least volume 1, into 80 pages, or the summary of the argument. So he's tries to do that, but he's also clear, to understand his argument, to understand Capital, and to understand the world, you need to read and you need to do rigorous study. And what does he say? Like, those who aren't willing to trek the mountain won't reach the luminous summits of knowledge, or whatever. Basically saying, you have to read and focus. Do you know what that quote is?
Yeah, I believe it's from Goethe. There's a few quotes. He always starts, like I know he starts Capital with a good quote like that. He starts the 59 sort of dress rehearsal for Capital. He starts it with a quote from Dante, um, something along the lines of, "Before you enter, all prejudices must be left aside." He also has some really good quotes from when he was very young, where it's something along the lines of like, for the intellectual, their life biography is definable by the works they produced, by their bibliography. It's something very sort of Herculean spirit, where like what really matters is not this abstract idea of a life that's divorced from your work, but what were you able to concretely produce? Like sort of writings were you able to put out there, and how were they able to help humanity? That's what really matters. And he embodied it in his life. There was always spies following what the hell Marx was doing. And when you read their descriptions of what he was doing, he would go on just long periods of a few days, constantly working. And then he'd take a few days where he would just have to relax. And when he gets a little older, and that sort of form of work just doesn't work anymore, he changed it up a little bit. And the descriptions that you see in like Paul Lafargue's eulogy of Marx. Lafargue, of course, was the husband of Jenny, and Lafargue was a Cuban Haitian. He was born in Cuba. He had Haitian background, and he married Marx's daughter. And he produces a wonderful eulogy where he talks about like the time that he spent with Marx, which was basically every day. And he ends up going through like Marx's routines and the sort of brilliant things that would just come up going through his daily stroll. But he ends up changing his habits towards sort of the middle of his life in order to be as healthy as possible to continue producing work. And it's the sort of person that his work and his commitment to the cause came before anything, even his life. And he had such an incredible amount of suffering that just came up in his life. And there's quotes from his daughters that are like, the only reason he really stayed alive after these sorts of events was to help the cause. Like if it wasn't for the cause, he would have just said, F it. The pain is too much. I'm just going to go. But, it tells us about the sort of ethic and the sort of way we should approach the world that Marxists should have. And this was something that we got into in the last class that we had yesterday, the second class that we've had for Marxism and the history of Western philosophy. But yeah.
Yeah, and that relates actually to a Twitter conversation I had earlier with our buddy Christian, who's a reformist socialist, but likes to read Marx. He did this poll. You can only read one of these for the rest of your life. Whom do you choose? Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Mao. And, I had been reading volume 2, and I said, as much as I praise the theory of Lenin, Stalin, and Mao, after reading volume 2 today, I'm reminded why Marx is the GOAT. Nobody did as much hard work as him in laying out a systematic analysis and critique of the capitalist mode of production, which gets to what Carlos was saying there, and the hard, rigorous intellectual work that Marx put in to understand capitalism, understand all the greatest thinkers, philosophers, historians, mathematicians, biologists who came before him, and using that to create his method, his dialectical materialist method, and then taking the time to apply that method to the capitalist mode of production, which then became the theoretical basis that Lenin, Stalin, and Mao drew from. And our buddy Christian says Marx was a genius on par, if not above, Newton, Einstein, and the like. And exactly, couldn't agree more. It was really, in a way, Marx applied Newtonian theories and the scientific method to the field of economics and politics, and yeah. So great thinker. Jacob here says, hold on. I've got done reading my first chapter of History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolshevik short course early today. That sounds awesome. Sounds like a great text to be reading. It's like what Lenin said, one of the chapters of State and Revolution, you can't trust certain translations. And Lenin, being the Giga Chad he was, went back to the original German texts and translated them to Russian. That is totally hardcore. Epic Lenin moment. I see our other comrade here says that volume 3 is yet to be translated to his language of Hebrew. So if anyone wants to be a Giga Chad like Lenin, get volume 3, learn Hebrew, read volumes 1 and 2, and then translate volume 3 to Hebrew for us. I had a final exam today in political philosophy, and one of the questions was about justice and Marxist philosophy. I didn't know what they meant. I don't know what they could mean by that either. A lot of people try and read moral philosophy into Marx, They pretend like he was a moral philosopher, like he was writing about how mean the bourgeoisie is. So the proletariat needs to overthrow them because they're such mean, bad, dirty guys. But in fact, that's not the case. But I don't know what could this mean? What could the Marxist theory of justice be, Carlos?
It would have to be one that understands that whatever concept of justice we have, which is always tied to the mode of life's judicature, so the series of laws and forms of thinking about rights and laws and punishments. Um, it would have to be one that understands that the concept of justice is historically constituted. So, what was just for the Greek slave democracies is considered unjust for the feudal order, and it could be considered unjust for the capitalist order, and etc. Justice is a historically constituted concept that, as a concept itself, it's not eternal. It's something that arises in a specific moment of history where you can begin to think about justice. It implies injustice. It implies a moment in society's development where people can look at something and say, well, that's wrong. Even by the standards that we have, it's wrong. And some of the people that end up approaching the question of socialism or the critique of capitalism through the lens of justice, they're usually the anarchists, eternalizing almost bourgeois from the standpoint of outlook, understanding of justice, of right, of equality. And it's not that form of thinking didn't play its role in the development of the history of thought, but it's been supplanted by Marxism. And, what we consider justice is not like this subjective and relativist understanding like the postmodernists have, but it's objective in character, but it's historically constituted. And it gets back to our worldview, which doesn't see any universal as abstract and rootless, but sees that anything that we can call universal is always concrete, is always rooted in in a specific time and place.
Just like every justice system, every system that's devised to carry out justice varies based on time and place.
Right.
So too do the ideas of justice. Yeah, cool. Hopefully you wrote that for your exam, comrade. But all right, Carlos hasn't seen this video yet. This one cracked me up. This is from some career lifetime propagandist from the U.S. State Department. Just one of these suits, one of these stooges, who's supposed to toe the State Department line and put out State Department propaganda talking points. But he made a bit of a slip up here.
A few things. So I will say, with respect to your first question, we believe the war has been a strategic failure for Ukraine. The secretary spoke to this in a speech he gave in Helsinki last month, I believe it was. What's that? I'm sorry. A strategic failure for Ukraine. Thank you for the correction. Which is I need more than one correction today. This is the first time at the podium for a week.
This is my first time at the podium telling the truth. Sorry. I'll get back to lying in a second here.
That's like Bush's a brutal criminal invasion of Iraq, and he's like, shit. Well, I guess Iraq too. But those are called Freudian slips, which means that the sort of unconscious truth that we recognize but don't want to say it explicitly, it ends up coming out, and that's what it is. It's been a tremendous failure for Ukraine, and honestly, if you really wanted to be fully truthful, for the U.S. and for the NATO forces that proved in the arena of universal history that they've lost the power that they had a few decades ago, and that they just can't complete the objectives that they have, and toppling the government in Russia, and their objectives in this proxy war against Russia just have been a complete failure. And that's not to say that the special military operations have gone fully as planned, but it's been very clear that Russia has been undoubtedly winning this war. And even though Ukraine has all the backing of NATO and NATO military forces and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars from the U.S. alone. It's been a tremendous defeat, just a squashing defeat.
And while Russia has been focused on what they need to do militarily and economically, geopolitically, in terms of forming alliances, the U.S. has been hyper focused on fighting the information war. Basically censoring any dissent and trying to put out this narrative that we need to fight to the last Ukrainian, for one, and that what this guy was trying to say there, but he accidentally told the truth, that this has been a strategic failure for Russia and Ukraine is winning. That's far from the truth. And now I think the information war is sort of starting to unravel for the U.S. now that this Ukrainian counteroffensive has failed so miserably. I've seen even some of just the most blatant, pro-Ukraine propagandists who would praise Ukraine and say they were winning in pretty much any situation. Even them admitting that the counteroffensive hasn't gone to plan, that it's basically been a failure strategically for Ukraine. Like this guy just let slip here. So yeah, it's going to be tough for the U.S. to continue lying, and it always takes a few months or a few years after the conflict before we start learning what was really going on behind the scenes completely. So I'm sure there will be a lot of people now who come out against the proxy war, who have been against the proxy war the whole time it was going on. Better late than never, I guess. But yeah, I mean, and we've gotten to see this firsthand as people who have been critical of the proxy war effort since day one. Like when Russia invaded, I think we lost 1,000 followers on Instagram because people were like, "You Russian imperialist bastards, how dare you not stand for the people of Ukraine, the wonderful liberal democracy of Ukraine." And with time and with the new stories that are have been coming out, with the each new U.S. action, like the terrorist attack on Nord Stream 2, people have begun to see this for what it is, a NATO proxy war, a U.S. imperialist project to try and threaten Russia and prevent Russia's economic development, prevent Russia from keeping control of their own energy sector and continuing to sell energy to countries in Europe who the U.S. Wants to keep a monopoly on as a trade partner. So, yeah.
Yeah, and the narrative is just it's starting to crumble, and you saw it a few weeks ago, maybe even a month ago, with the New York Times article where what was basically implied was that the level of Nazis in Ukraine's army is feeding into the Russian propaganda about Nazis in Ukraine's army. It's like it was such a contradictory headline where one part of the headline implied the truth of what the other part considered to be propaganda and false. So it's cracks in the narrative are slipping through, and social media, although it's been able to be used as a force where propagandizing people and indoctrinate them, if you want to use that term, is much easier than ever, especially if you accept this analysis that comes from the German Chinese philosopher Hans-Georg Müller, that today we construct our identity through the curation of our profiles, and therefore what we post, the relationship that we have to like our political views when we post them is much deeper than before. Like before you had the ability to separate like your authentic self from like your political positions, right? Today, who you are is tied to your profile, and your profile is necessarily political. You have to constantly comment on ethical and political questions. And so on one side, it's made propaganda much more entrenched than in years past. Like people's identities are conjoined to the political opinions that they put in their profiles. But on the other side, it's allowed spaces for dissenting opinions to almost sometimes accidentally break through the narrative. And there's an openness in at least a large chunk, I think, of the American people to see beyond the dominant narrative and look for alternative opinions, and that makes them susceptible to the sort of alternative opinions that are really just feeding into the dominant narrative. But it also makes them susceptible to people who are just speaking in the ways that we do, and similar voices who are critical in a form that is substantially critical of the existing order.
Absolutely. And I mean, you see that on TikTok, with, their social media is also a way to get information out, but it's also a form of brainwashing. And this is where the forms of controlled counter hegemony are so valuable to the ruling class, because you have a lot of kids radicalizing on TikTok, but then you have these figures like Vaush, who pull them into a community and an ideology that's completely compatible with the status quo, with neoliberal capitalism, and with the ruling class. So, yeah, and then being part of that online community in turn becomes part of their identity. And yeah, it's really nefarious the way that the ruling class is using social media to control thought and to control the narrative. So yeah, thank you so much to Mr. Palazzolo for the $5 super sticker. Appreciate that. He also donated to the Buy Eddie an iPad fundraiser. So thank you to everyone who donated to that. As soon as Buy Me a Coffee and their developers get off their butts and send the money, we'll have an iPad, and our TikToks will be hitting new levels of production value. So can't wait. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much, Ross, for €5 super chat. It's going to be very difficult for the media in Western Europe to backtrack on their total support of the Kiev regime. Absolutely. And that even, the EU had backed Maidan from the beginning. And now, it's not even really in the interest of the European countries to continue backing this proxy war. The sanctions are backfiring. They had to cut off one of their main sources of energy in Russia. But because the EU countries have been on board with Maidan and have been pushing out Ukraine propaganda since 2014, they're in too deep now. They essentially can't back out, even though what's going on is terrible for them economically and politically. It's basically impossible for them to backtrack. So, great point there, Ross. I'm gonna run to the bathroom. Carlos, you want to answer that question about your class there while I'm gone?
Yes, Michael, please do email either me or the Institute at midwesternmarx@gmail.com, because everyone who signed up should have received an email about the class with the syllabus and all the information. Even the 5 people that just signed up in this last week. And I just want to say we had the first official class last week where we did introductions. Everyone did their introduction, and then I presented a sort of a presentation I prepared called "What is Philosophy," which I'm considering making it into a video essay for the Institute's YouTube channel. But we did that, and it was such a fruitful introduction, and there was such good discussion that we ended up deciding to pass the content, the reading content of the first class to the second week. And we ended up adding a week. And so we felt comfortable with having 5 more people sign up for the class. I felt that I would be able to manage 5 more folks in the class. And the reason for keeping the classes relatively small to 20, 25 students is mainly because I want to be able to feel like I've fully answered every question. And the more people you have, the harder it is for that to happen. But we had our first content class yesterday. We spoke about Plato's Apology, which deals with the trial of Socrates before he's sentenced to death. And there was just such a enjoyable and insightful conversation. It was so good to talk to people, and honestly, it's so different from like teaching in university, where there's only like 2 or 3 people that are usually like really interested in the material. The vast majority of people, unfortunately, are just there to get the credits for the class and then to get the title, and that's pretty much it. But it's a sort of class where everyone that's there is interested in learning, and they want to comment, and it's really, really hard not to go over 2 hours. I tried my best yesterday, and we still ran around 2 hours and 40 minutes, and we covered the whole dialogue, and it was super insightful. At the end, we got into questions about death and existentialism and choices, and the sort of, whether there's a realm of philosophical thought and inquiry that Marxism hasn't really touched on, and maybe shouldn't even touch on. Maybe there's different forms of thinking that are more adequate to it. Like, you can provide a dialectical analysis for the uh, archetypical ethical conundrum that Sartre brings up, which is that, he tells the story of his student that comes to him and asks, like, hey, should I, this is in the middle of the Second World War, should I go to the war and be a soldier and play a small part in a big event, or should I stay home with my mother, who's, going to go through a hard time, considering there's a war and a lack of resources and stuff, and thereby play a big role in a small thing, right? And Pink Floyd's "Wish You Were Here," of course, takes up that in one of its first lines, which is, "Did you exchange a walk-on part in the war for a lead role in a cage?" But those sorts of questions, like, how do you apply a dialectical materialist analysis to that? How do you say, well, what has Mal said about this? It's these are deeply existential choices, and they have to be taken on a one-on-one basis. And I can almost infer what Eddie's gonna play. Dun, 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 dun. He's gonna play. Yeah, over here. Yeah, we had like the last 30 minutes of discussion. It was on those sorts of questions, and questions of like death and sacrifice and the relationship of that to the sort of lives and commitments that communists should have and ought to have. And Starback gave a wonderful quote from Luis Aragon, who was a French Communist Party member, who was talking about the willingness that communists should have to spill blood for the advancement of the class struggle. And it was such an incredibly enjoyable conversation. And yeah, it's 8 more, well, now 7 more weeks of that. So yeah.
Yeah, I can't wait. Sorry, I had to play a little "Wish You Were Here."
I can
To
play
go
too.
along
If
with
I would
that.
have had my guitar here, I would have played it with you. It's
That's such a good
what?
song.
It never gets old, dude.
That whole album from Pink Floyd is so underrated. I know people like Dark Side of the Moon. I like Dark Side of the Moon. I have a Dark Side of the Moon t-shirt, but um, that album, the Wish You Were Here album with Shine On You Crazy Diamond that they wrote for Syd Barrett, is so good. And the album cover even,
Where the businessman is on fire.
yeah,
Oh my god.
it's a representation of the capitalist influence on the music industry. You get the
Yeah.
businessman who's on fire. And yeah, so much anti-capitalist messaging in Pink Floyd's music. And one of the sickest things about them is what Roger Waters hasn't shifted to neoliberalism. He's still out here protesting to the point where he's just viciously being smeared by the media and these cowards who call him an anti-Semite for standing up for the people of Palestine. So solidarity with Roger Waters. But
Have you
yeah,
ever
I had
seen
something.
have you seen the version of Mother that Roger Waters recently did? I think it was right when the pandemic hit,
I
because
don't
all of
know.
his team was recorded on like individually, like they weren't together. But it's such a good song, man, and it's great to have Roger Waters still rocking with the people and not with the the money chargers and the powerful and the elite.
Yeah, and right, you kind of got to stay sharp because there's so many, what we call controlled agents of counter hegemony who pretend to be radical or pretend to be empathetic and compassionate, but it's actually just an imperialist ruling class ideology that's designed to trick people and co-opt people's radical energy and get them to support the establishment. So, yeah, I was going to tell a story about when Carlos and I were in undergrad, but he just left to pee for the 13th time this stream. So, I guess I'll save that for later. As an American, I can confirm that I am, in fact, obsessed with communism. Good. We need more Americans obsessed with communism. This video that we're going to talk about, the obsession with communism video, has more to do with why our government and why our ruling class is obsessed with communism. But it is an interesting, at least at this point in history, everybody's got an interesting story or an interesting journey with how they found their way to Marxism or communism. Because in America, you're told that it's the dumbest, most evil, foolish ideology that you could ever be tricked into believing. And then, the more Marxism you learn, the more you learn about dialectical materialism and the dialectical analysis of history, the more you're able to understand the world around you and the more you're able to understand history. So it's like the thing that they've told us to not look at, the thing that they've told us, don't even bother with it. It's stupid. It's evil. You'll accident, if you read one word of Marx, 1 million people will die of starvation somewhere on the other side of the world. That's the philosophy that's actually got the truth in it, or, the most truth in it. So it just shows that the bourgeois mode of production, at this stage of development is just entirely irrational and anti-truth. Carlos, I wanted to say, you were talking about how hard it is to get kids to actually pay attention and learn in undergrad when you're teaching. Do you remember the ecological, like eco-socialism class that we took? That class was literally me, Carlos, and our buddy, who was also a Bernie campaign guy and a socialist. Going back and forth while the rest of the class like sat on their phones or like slept, and it just drove me insane. I'm like, and I guess that was me probably my freshman year, but eventually I learned like, okay, I'm paying for this. I have genius professors here, and when I was in that class, I was like, this is so fascinating. I didn't get it, but like the students didn't put forward the effort to learn the basics and to participate in the class and to pay attention. So they just kind of fell off and tuned out. But I remember at one point, this girl in the class who had just been sleeping or on her phone and was just trying to get participation points. I swear one time she raised her hand and just tried repeating words that she had heard me and Carlos say in class and stringing them together to try and get participation. She was like, the neoliberalism is really just really bad, and we need to be philosophizing to how to combat the capitalist. It was like she was stringing together these big words that she had heard Carlos and I use in conversation to try and get participation points. But yeah, and it's weird how a lot of times proletarian people, uneducated people who have never been to college, are so excited and eager to learn Marxism or philosophy of any kind. Whereas these upper middle class sort of privileged Chicago suburbs kids that we went to college with, no offense to them, but a lot of them had no interest in socialism. A lot of them had no interest in learning. They were just there to get a degree so they can get a nice paying job. And that's it.
And that's important that you bring that up, which is coincidentally a topic that we touched on yesterday, the sort of relationship between truth and the radical critique of the form of life that you exist in. And I do think that truth is revolutionary, and that's why education is either defunded or the sort of education that ends up being promoted is always one that's very mechanistic and conclusion driven and doesn't really teach people how to think. It teaches them how to remember basic things so that they can be dumb enough to not question the existing order, but smart enough to at least work the machines and be the sorts of agents that can produce surplus value. But the quest for truth and the medium through which you do it, through which is education, and it doesn't have to be university education, is so radical, right? It always, I think, is bound to lead you to a questioning of the way that things are. And when people's class positions don't really line them up, for that quest, you'll end up seeing what we saw in that class. But I remember one of my most memorable parts was the second book that we read was Ishmael, which was a novel
Yes.
about a gorilla. This guy that goes to a gorilla that was supposed to be a very, very wise gorilla. And the gorilla spins this narrative about how humanity is basically evil and self-destructive because it's been killing the environment. And it's this very, like, um, I would almost say now, eco-fascist understanding of the world, where it's just blaming the environmental evils on humanity at large. And in the paper that I did in reply to that, I was like, this is stupid. This is like fake radicalism. What I ended up calling it, and I swear to God, this is a term that I know other people have used afterwards. When I started engaging with like the internet left, I had a few years of engaging with the actual socialist organizers, but I called it the synthetic left, like or a synthetic socialism, or a synthetic critique was the term that I used. A synthetic critique, because it didn't substantially attack what it had to attack. And the cause of the environmental catastrophe that we see around us is not humans, it's not humanity at large, but it's the mode of production that we have. And so I did that critique, and I received very positive comments from the professor. But it was the first time where that I can remember I was like reading something and I realized, oh, this is like a fake critique. It's not getting to the substance of it, while it's sustaining the form or the appearance of being radical. It's actually fully compatible with the way that things are.
Right. It's the idea that we've tricked ourselves. We've told ourselves the myth that we're progressing forward, but in fact, we're not progressing. We think we're on an airplane, a jet plane, but that plane is actually on fire and crashing towards the ground, is the analogy that they use. And, it totally ignores the sort of poverty alleviation and expansion of lifespans and, all the great things that are brought about technological advancements and industrialization. And it's told from the perspective of a gorilla, so it can kind of dismiss all those things and say, well, that doesn't help the gorillas, so is it even good? Is it even worth it? Really sort of an eco-fascist message there, the idea that plant life and animal life is more important than human life. Interesting text, though, and definitely an interesting book to read, and like got our minds open to new ideas, and the idea that something needs to be done about the environment. But then the professor, who was a Marxist, introduced next Facing the Anthropocene by Ian Angus, which is an awesome eco-socialist text that we do agree with, where it says, no, technological advancement is a good thing. Raising people out of poverty is a good thing, but we need to have a rational, managed mode of production, a mode of production managed by the working class, so that we can produce things in a way that's in harmony with the Earth's metabolic processes, and isn't causing this metabolic rift that leads to things like climate change, or metabolic rifts, plural, because there's a lot of ecological degradation that gets overlooked because we're just hyper focused on climate change. We don't talk about, the pollution of waterways as much, and the water supplies, or the decreasing number of species. It's not just climate change. So,
Right, and even that term, like Anthropocene, I have grown to be somewhat troubled by it, because again, it implies that the stage that is being described, where uh, humans have been able to alter the planet in ways that has never been seen before, that it's humans in general, when in reality it should be called a capital scene or something. There should be a name attached to it that's more directly connected to the fact that it's been the capitalist system that has done this, and not humans in general. Um, but still, Ian Agnes does that. He's got a section at the end of the book where he's like, here's why we use the term, and it's not because we want to blame all humans. We recognize that it's industrial capitalism, and specific what he calls fossil capitalism, that's doing this. It's been a result of the last 50 years. But yeah.
That's a good book. Got some super chats here. What do you say to all the cons who call commies jealous? The last time somebody said that, I made a video with my shirt off, flexing and showing my wrestling awards and saying, you're jealous of me. You're jealous. You can't be a commie and have these gains. So that's how I've been responding in the past. I don't know if that'll work for everybody. But I mean, yeah, I don't know. Do you have a better argument to this, Carlos? I mean, in a way, there is a sense of jealousy there of, pampered oligarchs who can not work a day in their lives and, still have time to spend time with their family and enjoy leisure and pursue whatever they want to pursue, and live in sort of material abundance. So there can be a hint of jealousy there, but that's not what, some people have argued that jealousy is what drives Marxism. Marx was just jealous and the working class needs to be jealous. And that's not it. It's just in the workers' material interest to collectively struggle against the ruling class. It's not driven by jealousy of the ruling class. It's not to become the bourgeoisie. It's to sublate the current system and move towards a system where there is no bourgeoisie.
Right, and all of that is usually rooted in Nietzsche. And the most coherent forms that you see of it today, they're explicit about the fact that the critique that they're making is Nietzschean, or that Nietzsche had already seen the thing that they're describing. And it's rooted in an understanding of ressentiment and Nietzsche's theory that the development of slave morality is grounded in a transvaluation of value, whereby in the face of the impotence of poor people to achieve power and wealth and all these other things that are tied to the concept of good, that they create the concept of evil for that which is good, and then that which is bad ends up then becoming good. And it's a transvaluation of value that's a little bit more profound than just turning things over, because the category of evil is invented in the process. And that impotence develops, the first form that it develops is as jealousy. And, there's a whole field of studies in this area. This sort of analysis is taken up by Max Scheler, who critiques Nietzsche for seeing it rooted in Christianity. He sees it rooted in other forms of pagan thought and not in Christianity. And it gets taken up by a whole series of other people. But I think that there is the existence of ressentiment in the left, but I don't see it in the people that, like, the conservatives see it in. I see it in the Western left, in the Western Marxists, and in the way that they approach socialism in the global South and East. Like in Marx's writings, specifically the ones that were published in his lifetime, not like the later works that are posthumously published, he's very explicit about the fact that it's the most developed societies, that societies with the most developed form of capitalism, that will have socialism first. So England, Germany, the U.S., France, the European, Anglo-European countries. And those don't have socialism first. It's Russia, China, Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, and a few other countries in the global South and East. And I think that, like, tied to the ideology of the purity fetish, and the desire for this pure form of socialism to realize itself, if it doesn't do that, then it's not socialism, there's emotively the phenomenon of ressentiment, where there's a deep emotional resentment of these places. And that's why you can't read a contemporary, and I mean, contemporary not just today, but for the last 100 years, a contemporary book from Western Marxism without hearing about Stalinism or about authoritarianism or not real socialism within the first 5 pages. Before you even get to a critique of capitalism, you have a critique of the communism or socialism that appears in the global South and East. That's a deeply emotive connection that pervades their everydayness. And I describe that in the book on the purity fetish as ressentiment. It's a form of resentment. Because those people who were supposed to be the last ones to achieve socialism actually achieve it, we're going to have this transvaluation of values where we call whatever they're doing not actually socialism, and then effectively end up aligning our political practices with imperialism. So I do think resentment and the critique of resentment is still relevant, but at least I personally go about it in a way that that's completely unlike what these conservatives do it. Like, I critique the Western left for not being communist enough and for being purity fetishists. So that's a
There you go. Is that a good enough answer for you, Lemonheads? I think you got your $1.99 worth there. Thank you for that, by the way. Now the other super chat doesn't want to pop up for me. There we go. Have you guys talked about what you each plan on writing for the Journal of American Socialist Studies issue 3? I don't know. I'm kind of torn. I have a lot of ideas, but I'm not sure what I'm gonna do yet. Do you have yours narrowed down, Carlos? I think we've talked about this, but
well, first we opened up the call for submissions, I think 2 weeks ago, and we're going to start marketing that call a little better. We already have 5 essays that we've accepted, but my essay is the English version of what I published in, or it's actually coming out in a couple of days. It's a dossier out of a scientific magazine in Cuba called Temas. And I am publishing in that dossier, and then they're getting a longer form of it, and they're publishing as a chapter within a book, and the subject of which is the contrast of individual and social rights in the U.S. And in part, I do an analysis of our healthcare system and other considered social rights and show how they don't exist in the U.S. And I reframe the understanding of here's individual rights, here's social rights, and I argue that really to secure the rights of the individuals in a meaningful fashion, you need to secure social rights, right? You can't have like the freedom of speech if you're hungry. You can't have political freedoms if you're homeless. Like, you can't understand the one without the other. So I provide a dialectical analysis of social and individual rights, and I end up making the argument that by not securing social rights, the U.S. also doesn't secure individual rights. And I cite the censorship that they do to us and other groups. And really the only rights that they end up defending are the rights of capital to accumulate. So I flesh out that argument in a relatively long paper, and the English version of that will appear in the Journal of American Socialist Studies. Oh, and
awesome.
Conjoined with that is the fact that all the most important theoreticians and minds in our country who align themselves with the tradition of like the Declaration of Independence argue that in order to secure these rights, the practical and logical conclusion is socialism. So I bring up MLK, John Dewey, and Thomas Paine, and these figures that are accepted in the common sense understanding of Americans to show that like we should have socialism. If we want to be honest and consistent with our explicit beliefs and the explicit ideals through which we found ourselves, we should have socialism. We can't, by having a capitalist form of life, we are in contradiction to what we say that we are for.
All right, I'm looking forward to that, or to reading that. Thank you, Jordan, for the $5 super chat. Really appreciate that. You definitely got your money's worth as well. Moving on, another one here from Lemonheads. Rural and urban have more in common than suburban. I guess in many ways true. There's always been a rural-urban divide, and that's true of pre-capitalist societies and capitalist societies. But I guess with capitalism, you really have the formation of these urban city centers and these industrial towns that are really distinct from the countryside. You have the enclosure of the commons and the forcing of a lot of people into the cities. So definitely a divide there. But it's always been in the interest of the working class and the rural class to unite and fight. We have the Worker Peasant Alliance in China and Russia, where you have peasants who are basically part of a different mode of production, the feudal part of the economy, allying with the proletariat to have a revolution. So I agree in many ways. How can you be a materialist but not an atheist? You just have your beliefs, but you don't read them into your analysis of capitalism in the world, I guess. I don't know. It's kind of hard. I don't know. Eventually, if you're reading and if you have religious beliefs, and as you continue to read theory and dialectical materialism, it might encourage you to put them to the side, I guess, and kind of no longer use a religious lens to view the world. Not the case for everybody. But for some who are religious and get into Marxism and reading Marx and dialectical materialism. But I mean, the main thing you just have to understand how religion works how it's used as a way to maintain power, and what Marx means when he says religion is the opium of the people. Like, it's this way for people to have community and to have relief in a system where they're alienated and exploited all the time. And it's also one of the main ways that the ruling class pushes ideology. They do it through the churches, they do it through the pulpit, they do it through institutionalized religion. So have your religious beliefs, but as a Marxist, as a materialist, you have to understand how religion is utilized by the ruling class. And yeah, we're all for religious socialists, but when it comes to Marxism and debates about Marxism, it is a materialist philosophy. It's not a dogmatic idealist or religious philosophy. So yeah, got a little tripped over my words there, but
It's a very difficult question, and we're hoping to have an interview with Roland Bohr, who's written a 5-book series on criticism of heaven and a few other books on Marxism and religion. He comes from a evangelical background and is one of the leading Marxist scholars in the Anglophone world, teaching in China at the moment. But it's an ambiguous and contradictory relationship, and there's we're always going to have to bring the complexities in the question out if we want to be fair in our response. And the reality is that in some instances, religion has been revolutionary and has been used towards revolutionary ends. Some of its kernels have been taken and used to construct progressive and revolutionary projects, such as the Black Church in the U.S. and liberation theology and Thomas Müntzer and the German peasant revolts and the charters in England and the Quakers in the early U.S., which were abolitionists and somewhat of utopian socialists and certain utopian socialist communities. So there's a wide array of examples, and the early Christian communities, which were virtually a form of ascetic communism, so a form of poverty communism. And Engels was looking at towards the end of his life, and then Kautsky picked up the project after Engels' death. But the homologies, the similarities between the early Christian communistic communities and the early modern movement towards socialism. And there's certain quotes in Marx's letters where he's asked, where has communism ever worked? And he's like, go look at the letters of St. Paul. So there's a positive side of religion, and there's obviously the side of it working as an opium, keeping people in a dormant state and pacifying or nullifying the evils that they experience in their everyday life, making them inactive through the belief that there's an afterlife in which, instead of them being the last ones, they're the first. So these contradictions have to be carried in. Any answer that tells you it's one and not the other, it's usually going to end up being one-sided and incorrect. You have to get at the complexities, and it also requires a historical analysis, like criticizing religion in 1840s Germany when Frederick the Fourth grabs power, and to speak of politics is to speak of political theology. Criticizing religion there is extremely radical. That's why the young Hegelians would get fired from their university posts, and some excommunicated and imprisoned. Criticizing religion today, as the young atheists do, it's nothing like what it was in the 1840s. So the context is also important, and this is something we got into in yesterday's class, and how the death of Socrates is reduced to a critique of religion and what that means for us today. But I don't want to keep ranting about this. I could speak about this for a few days in a row, so I'll stop here.
One of the differences too I noticed when we're both analyzing it is Carlos wasn't raised in a religious family, so he never had the dogmatic religious worldview of the world, whereas I was. My grandpa was a pastor at an evangelical church my whole life, and I was just raised in that kind of situation. So like, I'm totally on board with having religious socialists, right? And like Charles here says, in U.S. history, Christian radicals have done as much or more than the atheists, John Brown, MLK, for sure. And you have the use of the black churches, as sort of a site of resistance and safety, when slavery was going on and during the civil rights movement. Totally agree with that from a systemic level. I'm saying from a personal level, the more Marx I read, the less religious and dogmatically that I viewed the world. And the more I realized that I had these things from my upbringing, that I was using I was viewing the world through a tainted or through a religious dogmatic lens. And reading philosophy helped me to stop doing that and helped me to critique my own dogmatic beliefs. So yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to get at there too, without offending any of my family members who might be watching this. But, it's a tricky subject for me.
And I agree with you. I don't think that there's a space for supernatural religions in dialectical materialism. The most you could say, someone mentioned Spinoza's God. Spinoza's God is just nature. It's the totality of being, the background out of which everything else is then possible. The material conditions for the possibility of everything else and all other modes of being, whether it's the mode that it takes in thought, which is an emergent property of the most highly organized matter, or just regular extended matter, res extensia. Maybe that God, but when you get to like Spinoza's God, it's not even really a God. To use the word God, it's somewhat, I would think, incorrect, but he did use it, and he was excommunicated by the Jewish community for doing it. I actually read, and this is a point that, let me check real quick, the guy's name, Will Durant. Will Durant makes it in his Story of Philosophy, which is that he got excommunicated in part because the leader of the community was gone for like a few weeks when the subject came up, and someone else had to take the decision on Spinoza. And by the time the guy came back, the leader of the community would have likely kept Spinoza in the community, but he was excommunicated either way. And yeah, one of the greatest philosophers in the history of philosophy ended up just being a lens crafter and living in someone's, I believe it was their attic, in a regular family's attic for most of their life, coming down only to take breaks and eat in between writing and reading. But he was absolutely brilliant. And yeah, his God is the one that Einstein said that he believed in, which is just this neutral totality of nature.
All right. Well, should we go on to Tucker Carlson talking about AI? Now that humans are building God, Tucker Carlson's got a lot to say about it. Obviously, one of the first jobs that people have been talking about being automated with AI technology are truckers. And I mean, people have been talking about that for a while because of the self-driving cars that Elon Musk and Tesla have been pushing. Even though if you actually look into the self-driving cars that Tesla has been pushing, they've been promising self-driving cars for like 5 years now. And we still don't have them. So they're just continually lying about that technology in order to draw money from investors, or Elon is, and lying about the place that they're at and then excusing it by just saying, well, we're headed in the right direction. Right. It's okay to be ambitious and say that you're going to have self-driving cars in 2017 and then not have them by 2023. But either way, neither here nor there. Tucker Carlson, talking to Ben Shapiro, was asked about self-driving cars, and he gave a pretty based answer. There was another recent, I don't know how recent it was, but another clip from this conversation, I think it was the same conversation between Carlson and Shapiro, where Shapiro's just giving his, bland right-wing talking point. Socialism is evil. Why are so many kids today socialists? And Tucker's like, well, look at the economy. You have kids who are working hard, kids who aren't doing drugs all day, who are working hard to get a degree, working multiple jobs, and they still don't have enough money to pay their rent. They still don't have enough money to get by. And you're surprised that, kids are turning to socialism rather than capitalism. And Shapiro's head about exploded. But that's what happens when you just throw a little bit of critical thinking and a little bit of critical thought into these conservative dogmas and talking points, which obviously Tucker Carlson has been doing more of lately. So let's watch the video and then we'll meet back here and discuss.
Eddie, I just sent you the longer version of the video. I don't know if you're only able to find the shorter one, but there's a 2-minute one where he's a little bit more fleshed out in his argument. I don't know if you want to watch that.
Oh, I'm muted. Sorry. I was trying to say, send it to me in the private chat.
It is, well, I sent it to you through Twitter. So let me go and put that in the private chat real quick. But I haven't seen the version that
I got her.
You got it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm glad I didn't open my DMs from. I have a DM from somebody that would have caused a lot of
four-year college
if people saw it. So we'll leave that up to people's imagination who that character was. I'm excited to see what they sent me. Actually,
it was Mia
right.
Khalifa.
Yeah, it was Mia. We're mutuals again. No, when we were mutuals on TikTok, I DM'd her and she responded. She said like "Viva la Revolucion" or something. I was like, I love you.
If you wake up one morning and you find yourself in a society where if you wake up one morning and you find yourself in a society where 23-year-olds with
this includes the clip that I was talking about. This is perfect. If I
do you want me to pull it up? I probably have better signal.
Yeah, you pull it up.
Okay, I'll do that. 1 second.
Leak the DMs. I can't. I don't want to get canceled.
No, not canceled. You don't want Stevie to come after you. Okay. This is Tucker Carlson talking to Ben Shapiro.
if you wake up one morning and you find yourself in a society where 23-year-olds with 4-year college degrees and like initiative who aren't smoking weed every day, if they can't make enough to buy a car, much less a home, much less get married, much less have children, then why should you be surprised when half of them say they prefer socialism?
Well,
you should not be surprised.
I agree to a certain extent. I think that the question is when the pedal hits the metal. Like you talk in the book about technology and how it's shifting and taking away jobs from folks. Yes. And you make specific reference to truck driving and the fact that there are going to be these automated cars on the roads. So would you, Tucker Carlson, be in favor of restrictions on the ability of trucking companies to use this sort of technology specifically to, sort of artificially maintain the number of jobs that are available in the trucking industry?
Are you joking? In a second. In a second. In other words, if I were president, would I say to DOT, to Department of Transportation, we're not letting driverless trucks on the road, period. Why? Really simple. Driving for a living is the single most common job for high school educated men in this country, in all 50 states. By the way, that's the same group whose wages have gone down by 11% over the past 30 years. The social cost of eliminating their jobs in a 10-year span, 5-year span, 30-year span is so high that it's not sustainable. So the greater good is protecting your citizens from, look, capitalism is the best economic system I can think of, I think that anyone's ever thought of, but that doesn't mean that it's a religion and everything about it is good.
No, but
there's no Nicene Creed of capitalism that I have to buy into. What I care about is living in a country where, decent people can live happy lives, actually. And so, no, I would say immediately, no, are you joking? And I maybe would make up some pretext for public consumption, like, oh, they're dangerous. The technology is not quite finessed. No. But the truth would be, I don't want to put 10 million men out of work because you're going to have 10 million dead families, and the cascading effect from that will wreck your country.
So
Ben just
well, actually, let me just say why capitalism is actually the best.
Ben Shapiro destroyed by facts and logic once again. That's super interesting. You see, I mean, like I said, Tucker's got a little bit of populism and a little bit of critical thinking in him, and that's just enough to blow apart the conservative dogmas that Ben Shapiro spews every day without pushback. He goes on these echo chambers and gives these pro-capitalist talking points and treats capitalism like it's a religion, where you need to embrace every aspect of it. And when he meets a little bit of pushback, he implodes. But obviously, Tucker is just saying that we should stop the advance of technology, the march of technology, in order to protect these truck drivers, when in fact, under socialism, that technology would liberate us. It would liberate us from having to drive on the road 10 hours a day to bring materials back and forth. We could have self-driving cars do it, but under a capitalist system, and this is something Marx details in depth in Capital Volume 1, automation throws workers out of the workplace. It throws them onto the streets. So rather than automation liberating humanity from these really hard jobs, this really hard, dangerous toiling, it instead throws people into poverty. It throws people into homelessness. And that's what we're seeing now with AI, threatening all these graphic designers and editors and truck drivers and stuff. It's the same thing that automation has always done. Same thing that happened in the Industrial Revolution when new machines were making it so, you needed less workers to produce the same amount of commodities, threw people out of the workplace. So the answer is socialism. Capitalism's not the best economic system that anyone's ever thought of. It's actually not an economic system we just thought of and invented. It's a system that developed out of other systems. But we can do much better. We can use automation, harness the advance of technology, and use it to liberate and improve society and get rid of material want.
I'm so proud right now because those are all the things that I wrote down. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this idea that you think about capitalism and then you do it is completely inverse. You start reflectively thinking about what capitalism as capitalism is in reality, a few hundred years after you've had capitalist practices come to dominate and become the dominant mode of production. Adam Smith is not talking about capitalism. He's talking about industrialists and masters. And it's really at the sort of quarter to middle of the 19th century where you can begin to talk about capitalism as a system. So that's one thing there. But I mean, for him, who was like the largest show in mainstream media, from Fox News, the most watched show, for him to say capitalism is not a religion, yeah, it might be the best. That's like mandatory to say for these guys, but it's not a religion. It's not something that we should avow to all the time, that sometimes you should put human life and what he calls the common good above it. It's kind of huge. It's an opening that we should learn how to exploit with these people and say, like, why should we even think about letting profit be the motive behind everything else, right? Why only think about it in these terms for some areas, right? Why not sustain that really it's people and the common good that should matter, and the reason why we should produce and our considerations for production should be grounded on meeting people's needs and making sure that they can flourish, and not on a small group of people getting exorbitantly rich through the profits that they make. But it's still an opening that we can exploit. The other thing is the point that you make about stopping technological development, and these gets at the assumptions that we have in the U.S. about what socialism is. Socialism as poverty and making everyone equally poor, and that's the complete opposite of like Marxian socialism. There's other forms of socialism that are like that, like the levers and a few other forms of historical utopian socialism that are grounded in like an ascetic understanding. We talked a little bit last stream we did together when we were covering Lasordo's paper about the ascetic Christians who were criticizing Lenin's turn towards the NEP and the sort of shift of focus towards developing the modes of production. But for Marxists, the idea is that one of the main reasons why capitalism has within itself, not externally, but within its own composition, the potential for socialism is because the development that we have is stifled by the relations of production, which is very easy to think about today. Like, what gets produced and why? Well, it's what's profitable. There's a whole host of things that don't get produced and don't even come into the conversation because we know that they're unprofitable to produce. So producing not for the sake of profit, but for other sakes, for other ends, obviously can allow production to be much more efficient when thought about through the lens of like, how is this meeting people's needs and allowing the common good, or everyone, human beings in general, to flourish. So self-driving trucks would take a whole bunch of necessary labor and make it unnecessary, right? It would free up what someone like Martin Hoagland calls socially socially free time, right? Instead of socially necessary labor time, socially free time, or socially allowed leisure time. Like, it would allow us to be freer people, not having to do necessary things, necessary work, and to be able to do other forms of creative work and exert our abilities in other things. And that's what a rational society would do. Like, oh my God, we're able to not have waitresses, or we're able to not have truck drivers. Awesome. Now we have tens of millions of people who don't have to do that 60 hours a week and who can do something else freely. And maybe the rest of the work that we still have to do, now we could divide it so that each person has to work less and has more free time to spend with their families and to be creative and be artistic, etc., etc. That's what a rational socialist society would do, and that's what rational socialist societies are doing. So there's contradictions in Tucker's response. There's a lot of people on the left that I've seen react to this, like, oh my God, Tucker's based, and oh my God, he's the voice of reason. And to some extent, yeah, he's prioritizing the common good and human beings, but it has to be understood within a context that's already irrational, which is that, I mean, if you can develop something that force people to work, that allow people to work less, like, what are the assumptions that are guiding your idea of why we have to suppress this? It's because you think capitalism has to continue. And insofar as he's already questioning that, there's an opening that we can exploit and show that irrationality to him. But there's a rational kernel in it, and there's a deeply irrational kernel in it as well. There's a deeply irrational mystical shell that the rational kernel is embedded in. And I think we should talk about both, as you rightfully did.
Absolutely. I think that's a pretty good breakdown of that. Got another super chat. Thank you so much. Super chats flowing in today. Appreciate that from everybody. Hello, guys. Sorry to distract, but what text focused on organization for revolution? And is it really only possible in war-torn, oppressed, poor countries? Pretty much anything by Lenin, a lot by Stalin, a lot by Mao. Mao's little red book is good. Foundations of Leninism is good. There are a lot of books about organizing and what to do. But I mean, the best thing you can do is read theory and then, get involved with the party. Really, the best thing you can do right now is read theory, honestly. But is it only possible in war-torn, oppressed, or poor countries? No. Actually, the original thesis was that socialism would come about first in the highly developed capitalist countries. What ended up happening is those countries became imperialist. Once the capitalists conquered the home markets, they went abroad, and you ended up having revolutions in in the case of China and Laos and Vietnam. Russia, when they had their revolution, were actually one of the imperialist countries. They were poorer than the other imperialist countries, but they were not a country necessarily under the boot of imperialism. They were sending their people to fight and die constantly in these wars for czarist expansion and czarist accumulation. And they turned a lot of the Russian soldiers against the ruling class. So in imperialist countries, you absolutely can have a revolution. In wealthy countries, you absolutely can have a revolution. This thesis that you can't have a revolution in wealthy countries is what we would call Maoism, third worldism. It's sort of a new ideology, and it's what one of these ideologies that pretends to be revolutionary, pretends to be cutting edge, leftist, the most Marxist ideology, but really it's completely compatible with the ruling class. It's the idea that there will be revolutions in all the quote unquote oppressed countries. And eventually that will lead to the collapse of the imperialist countries. But what that does is takes all the onus off of Western Marxists. It says, just wait for these countries in the global South to have revolutions. It's impossible to have one here anyways. Then we can just let them do all the work while we sit on our asses and do nothing. So it's an ideology that lends itself to the ruling class. It's sort of an anti-revolutionary ideology, ultimately, if you're in one of the imperialist countries. And it's a country that, like I said, places all the onus on our comrades internationally, our comrades in imperialized countries, when the best thing that we can do for countries in the global South, for existing socialist countries, for other countries around the world and our comrades around the world, is have a revolution here at home, overthrow the imperialist capitalist state here in America. Who says it's impossible? It's clearly not. Nothing's impossible.
That is so on the money. I'm considering forcing you to treat me like Joe Rogan's Jamie, because you're just saying everything that I would have said. And but I did end up adding 3 good sources on the chat. One of which is Mikhail Olgin. He was a Russian Jewish communist who came to the U.S. and was one of the major theoreticians of the Communist Party USA. It's one of his pamphlets on organizing from 1933, and then I put the 1935 CPUSA organization organizers manual, and then I put a Henry Winston text that where he talks about what it means to be a communist, and that also deals with the topic of organization. Of course, Lenin's What Is to Be Done deals with similar questions, somewhat of a different, very different context, but I would recommend those 3 sources from the U.S. as well if you're interested in organizing. And of course, there's other newer sources, but the main thing, and I think this is a very big flaw in the left today, is that organizing is thought of in terms of ideology, right? You go out and you look for people that already agree with you and you try to unite them. And it's not that that's wrong. Like, if we have communists in our communities, we should bring them into our organizations, and we should find who they are, and be able to link up and wage a united effort as communists. But really, the substance of organizing is convincing working people whose material interest is in line with socialism. And really, the substance of socialism is this advance of the class struggle of the working class towards political power. It's convincing them to adopt socialist ideas and the socialist struggle in an explicit, for itself, class conscious, socialist conscious form. And that requires organizing on the basis of class, not on the basis of ideology, not dismissing people because their social consciousness is not pure enough, right? That's the purity fetish in the realm of organizing. But organizing people on the basis of class, regardless of their starting point, try to find the rational kernels that you can then get and re-articulate towards where you need them to go, which is socialist consciousness. So if you're talking to a very religious person, go to the parts of Christianity that are rational and revolutionary, and use that to take them to where they need to go. If you're talking to, a Democrat working class dude who's scared of the far right and the fascist threat, then connect how it is that fascism is tied to capitalism and the role that the DNC is playing in propping up the what he considers to be fascism. And there's always a rational kernel, something rational in their incoherent worldviews that you can get and then use to guide them to socialism. So that's really the main thing. Always organizing your workplace in your communities, and realize that there's no copy-paste approach to organizing. You have to really get a feel for it, and get a feel for where it is that people are, and on the basis of that, know where it is that you have to start the process of their radicalization towards socialism. So that's what I would say.
Well said. I really recommend that CPUSA manual. There are things that have changed in the U.S. now, obviously, and that has implications for organizing. But that manual was written at a time when the CPUSA was incredibly powerful and was doing a lot of good work. And there's a lot of really, really, really practical organizing questions that are answered in that manual, questions that would come up time and time again in an organizing situation. So yeah, let's move on to our main event for today then. Why Americans are obsessed with communism. Man, this one came in the Discord and I've been saving it for a while. I listened to part of it by myself and I was like, okay, this is one I got to break down with Carlos and or Noah. Otherwise I'm gonna miss something because there's too much there. So like I said, this lady is talking about why the US government is so obsessed with communism, which my dad has told me back in the day when the Cold War was going on, he always used to think in the back of his head, like, right, so we're fighting these wars to stop the spread of communism. Communism's a governmental system or a way of managing society. Why aren't these other countries allowed to go with their own way of managing society? Why aren't they allowed to have their own government? Why do we have to go to war with them to stop the spread of communism? So I think this is a question a lot of people have had in the back of their head. People who, not Marxists, obviously, just regular people inundated with McCarthyism and imperialist propaganda, probably thought to themselves at one point, wait, we're going to war with these countries to stop them from being communist? So that's kind of what the question this lady is going to try and answer. Why is the U.S. ruling class, why are the U.S. imperialists so obsessed with communism and stopping the spread of communism?
It's also important to call out the hypocrisy in the founding of the American project, because what's one of the central notions that's driving the Declaration of Independence is the right to revolution, and an understanding from a sociological standpoint that really people only do revolutions when the oppression has gotten to such a point where they realize that it's preferable to risk what's implied in a revolution than to continue on in the old way. So in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America, you have an understanding that revolutions are not just a thing you say, okay, let's do this on Tuesday. They're a product of accumulated exploitation and oppression of the people that reaches a nodal point, a specific point where they then end up revolting in a revolutionary manner. And two, that revolutions are justified because they end up being the expression of a people that feel like their government doesn't represent them anymore, right? So if we're a country that was founded on the right to revolutionary, which at its time was a revolutionary way of founding a country, no other country was founded on that right. Why has it been that we have been the country that has played the leading role in stomping other countries that have had their own revolutions around the world, right? So calling out hypocrisy is always so important for this task that we were talking about earlier of, going from common sense to socialism, because the American people accept, in their majority, the Declaration of Independence and the values that are there. One of them is the right to revolution. And if you bring this to question, it forces them to think, yeah, it's true. If these countries decided, as the Declaration of Independence says, that people at some point end up doing, to have a revolution, isn't it not only their right, but the Declaration of Independence says their duty to dispose of their government? And if it is, why are we intervening to prevent them from doing that? Isn't that against our own principles? Which means, isn't that making us into hypocrites? And putting us in contradiction with what we say are our principles and the principles we espoused in order to have the anti-colonial revolution against Britain. It's a different approach to organizing and to tackling these questions than the ones that the modern left brings to the table, I think. Much more effective, in my view, or at least in my experience.
On April 30th, 1975, the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon fell to the Communist North Vietnamese army. After years of extremely deadly warfare that did nothing to turn the tides of communist takeover of the country, the South Vietnamese army could no longer continue the fight. The United States, after propping up the South Vietnamese and joining the fight against the Communist North, had pulled out 2 years prior, declaring the war.
They didn't join the fight, they started the fight. There would have been no South Vietnamese army, just like there would have been no South Korean army, if it wasn't for the U.S. occupation, bombing campaign, and funneling of arms and weapons into their preferred groups. The South Vietnamese government, that was just a puppet government set up by the U.S., was being chased out of power as the U.S. was still leaving Vietnam. Their helicopters were still flying over the jungle as the communists were chasing out the South Koreans. Nobody wanted to fight for this U.S. puppet dictatorship, which is why the U.S. military had to get so heavily involved. Same with Korea. They wanted to do it through proxy. They wanted to do it through just U.S.-backed soldiers on the ground. But there was nobody who would fight for the U.S., so we decimated both countries with bombs, Agent Orange, and napalm, and occupied the southern part of them.
A failure and withdrawing aid to the country that it had helped to destabilize. Now, a few thousand American army and diplomats remained in the country, and with the fall of Saigon, the remaining U.S. citizens, along with the Vietnamese citizens who aided them and their families, were in imminent danger. In the days leading up to the fall of Saigon, the North Vietnamese army was advancing rapidly, and it quickly became apparent that they would soon take the city. Vietnamese living in Saigon stood in lines outside the American embassy, attempting to get visas and flee the oncoming army, knowing that any connection to the U.S. would mean detention or death once the Northern Army took over. On April 29th, the North Vietnamese began shelling the U.S. airbase in Saigon, and the mass evacuation began. By this point, the North Vietnamese had blocked all waterways and airways to and from Vietnam. No planes could land and no ships could come to the rescue. The only way out was via helicopter evacuation to waiting U.S. Army ships out in open sea. The U.S. Embassy became the only way to escape Saigon. 10,000 Vietnamese pushed against U.S. Embassy gates, hoping to get a spot on the departing helicopters. Pilots flew for 19 hours straight. Helicopters landed in 10-minute intervals across the U.S. Embassy grounds, including on the embassy roof. In less than 24 hours, over 7,000 people were evacuated from Saigon via helicopter, including 5,500 Vietnamese citizens. On April 30th, what remained of the U.S.-backed South Vietnamese government resigned unconditionally, and North Vietnamese tanks drove through the streets of the now occupied South.
This is what happens when you try and set up a fucking government on top of another country's government. I can't stand how the fall of Saigon is always portrayed as this tragedy, where these the poor U.S. military base was shelled and they had to evacuate. We invaded their country, destroyed their land and people with Agent Orange and napalm for 20 years straight, and neighboring Laos and Cambodia. And then when they chased us out militarily, we acted like they were the aggressors, and they were the bad guys. When we tried to set up our own puppet government on top of their democratically elected government. And it was all to fight communism. That was literally how they justified it. We need to stop the spread of communism. As if people aren't allowed to choose their own system of governance.
I mean, what the fuck do these people think a revolution is? A picnic? Like, it always fractures society, and there's always going to be, usually, if it's a socialist revolution, a small percentage of the population that is in favor of keeping the old way of things because they benefited from it, or because they were working on their false consciousness and thinking that they benefited from it when objectively they didn't. But I mean, you could do this for any revolution, right? You take the American bourgeois revolution, like, of course, there were British people, going back to Britain, and that passage back wasn't all that friendly because they were loyalists and there had just been a revolutionary movement against the crown. You could take the example of France. You can take any bourgeois revolution because it's a general component of revolutions themselves. Revolutions are a form of civil war. A portion of the old people, the dominant classes, ends up aligning with the old order and not with the new one, and a large chunk of the people end up aligning and being the force behind the new revolutionary overthrow of the existing state of affairs. And it always fractures society, usually not equally, but like, compare the numbers that they're giving to like the rest of the Vietnamese population. But when they only focus in and narrow in on this small percentage of people, it's the same thing they do with Cuba. And the Cuban bourgeoisie that fled after the revolution, and the petty bourgeoisie and the intelligentsia that fled. It's like, yeah, if that's your narrative and you're basing it on 1% or 3% of Cubans, I mean, what can I tell you? It's just not true. It's not the reality that the vast majority of Cubans experienced during and after the revolution. And the same thing here with the Vietnamese.
I mean, all you ever have to do with these imperialist interventions is put the shoe on the other foot. Imagine Russia invades the U.S. and sets up their own government in Florida. And they're like, this is the government of the U.S. now. And then a bunch of American citizens side with Russia and start fighting the government. Like, yeah, those people would be detained. Those people would face prison time or whatever. Those people wouldn't be allowed to just walk free after siding with a colonial imperialist government trying to take over your country. But yeah, it just hyper focuses on those people and says, oh, look at these brave refugees fleeing the crazy Vietnamese communists who are defending their own country and trying to have democracy like crazy people.
Saigon. A military government was instituted, and on July 2nd, 1976, the country was officially united as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. What started as U.S. intervention to keep communism from spreading further into Asia ended in a bloody, failed, years-long war that resulted in over 58,000 U.S. military deaths and over 3 million Vietnamese people killed. And for what? Well, to fight the commies, of course. The United States' defeat of Vietnam betrayed an uncomfortable truth that many Americans don't want to admit to this day. Maybe a war against communism can't be won. Maybe the lines between us and them, between the good guy and the bad guy, once so seemingly clear and incredibly black and white, are much more blurry than our collective imagining of the American consciousness can account for. But how did we get here? Why did the United States take on the fight to root out communism at all costs in the first place? And what does it accomplish? I set out to figure out the answer to this question, and what I found, frankly, can't be thoroughly summed up in a tidy YouTube video. But I'll do my best to explain why the United States is so obsessed with communism. Roll the intro.
That was pretty interesting there. And this is where I stopped watching the video and said, I'm just going to watch this with Carlos. So I haven't seen it after this point. But yeah, of course, we know why the U.S. is so obsessed with communism. It's because of capitalist imperialism, because they recognize communism and Marxism as the greatest ideological threat to the ruling class, to the capitalist class. So they want to shut that down wherever it goes. They want to stop communists from gaining power. Once capitalism becomes a global system, class struggle becomes global. These contradictions become global. So it's not just the ruling capitalist class trying to stop class struggle in their own country, but they try and prevent class struggle abroad in other countries. And if it looks like a working class is going to seize power and create their own government, like what's happened in Cuba or Laos or Vietnam, they're going to try and stop that. Because as we're seeing now with the rise of this multipolar world, if there are more socialist countries trading with each other and helping each other develop and showing solidarity with one another, it hurts the U.S.'s economic interests. It prevents the U.S. from exploiting those countries and holding them in a state of arrested development, preventing the advancement of their productive forces. And it allows the U.S. to super exploit them. So, these countries moving towards communism hurts the U.S.'s economic interests. And that's what it's all about.
Growing up in the United States as a teen in the early 2000s, I remember being taught a pretty whitewashed and sterile version of U.S. history, especially our history and conflicts related to communism. The conflicts we were involved with as a nation were written as almost preordained. This happened because it had to happen, as though history is a series of logical steps, as opposed to a messy smattering of events that we have to organize in hindsight. And the United States history with communism is certainly messy. But before we get into why the heck we're so obsessed with it, let's get some definitions out of the way. What the heck even is communism? Well, to answer that question, we also have to answer the question, what is socialism? Because communism is a type of socialism, or an outgrowth of socialism. In the most basic sense, socialism is a social and economic system that involves public, as opposed to private, ownership and control of property and natural resources. Under the socialist view, individuals live in cooperation with one another, and everything people produce is in some sense a social product. So everyone who contributes is also entitled to a share in the production of society. Therefore, the society as a whole should own or control property for the benefit of all its members. This is, of course, an extremely simplified view of socialism, and two key divisions have occurred to complicate this doctrine. First, socialists disagree on...
I was going to say, under capitalism, everything that's produced is a social product still. It's just the way that that production is managed and the way that it's appropriated. The surplus of that product is appropriated privately by capitalists. The people who own the productive forces, but who aren't involved in the collective production process. So production is carried out collectively, you know, in factories, on assembly lines, whatever, humans meeting collectively to produce. But the surplus of what's produced is appropriated privately, appropriated by the capitalist who isn't even taking part in that collective act of production. So it's socialized production for individual appropriation. That's what capitalism is. Socialism is socialized production for the social good. Yeah. Her explanation wasn't horrible, but...
And at least she's honest. She says at the end it's a simplified thing. And I don't know how necessary it was for her getting to her next point. But nonetheless, I always quiver when I hear we got to get to the definition of socialism or the definition of communism, because it's like, well, you know, from the Marxist standpoint, at least, these things define themselves as they develop materially. If we're working with this sort of doctrinaire, idealist definition of what it is, we end up like the Western Marxists, which is rejecting actually existing socialism for this pure ideal in our head, this pure definition of socialism in our head. And that's not at all what the Marxists want. And I think the very basic level should be that socialism includes, at the most fundamental level, and you can then add determinations from there on, the working class's conquest of political power, or the producers' conquest of political power. That way we can include the peasantry. And that's it. And, you know, sometimes the capital is expropriated slower than in other times. Sometimes it's fully nationalized, as it was necessary in Cuba. Sometimes that's not the case, and you have a mixed mode of production, as you had in China. But those are questions that solve themselves only after the working class grabs power. So it's a working class government that begins to shift the state and the forces of production towards working for working people and being controlled by working people.
Right. I think it's notoriously hard to define socialism and communism. That's because, as Ingalls says, definitions can be useful, but they're also flawed. Because things are always developing, things are always changing. A definition of a thing is going to need to adapt or change and develop, which is why it makes no sense for these people who say, you know, China isn't real socialism, you know, based on the definition of socialism taken from a book 200 years ago or whatever. Like, well, they had a working class revolution and they're working to build a society and build a state free of exploitation. What do you call that other than socialism? You know, the exact definition of what socialism looks like is always going to be in flux. So that, you know, and you still have principles, you still have the word socialism still means something, but yeah, definitions aren't hard and fast.
The extent and kind of property that society should own and control. Should society own everything, including the shirt off your back? Or is there flexibility for some private ownership? What about small businesses like farms and shops? And second, there's disagreement about the way in which society is to exercise its control over property and resources. Via a centralized government, via a decentralized cooperation of multiple local governments, or something else. These ideas have been around for centuries, but socialism got its formal name around the 1830s.
I do want to say, too, because I feel that it's important the debate about centralization versus decentralization is so silly. You need both. You need both. You need decentralization for centralization to work, and vice versa. Perfect example, the party cadres and the poverty alleviation programs in China. You have party cadres who are in charge of every geographic area, right? That is decentralized. The people report to the cadres, tell them what they need, but then the cadres report back to the party so that decisions and economic plans can be made centrally, right? And so that central body of power, the state, can make sure that the entire economy is being carried out according to this central plan, according to what's best for society. And they're learning what's best from society from the party cadres, which again is a decentralized form of power. So these centralized forms of power, like the state and the Communist Party of China, work together with the decentralized forms of power or forms of the state or the party. So this debate between centralization and decentralization is kind of silly. And I think it just stems from anarchists saying all the time, I want a decentralized form of power. You know, I want the workers to meet in councils and decide everything. Like, do you guys know what the Soviets were? Like, no offense, but that's literally what the Soviets were in the Soviet Union. They were workers' councils where the workers could meet and decide things. So yeah, there's an obsession with decentralization and anarchism that I think is pretty useless.
And it's grounded again on a bourgeois either or. You either have centralization or decentralization, and you fail to realize in doing so that the positive character of centralization comes out through decentralization, and the positive character of decentralization comes out through centralization. It's the same thing as like how a party should function. Democratic centralism. If you don't have one, not only do you not have that one which you don't have, but you also lack the best parts of the other, right? They're interdependent in the sense that in order to fully have one, you need to have it with the other.
Dialectics.
And the idea of socialism as we know it today got its rise during the Industrial Revolution, which makes sense. You had a shift from agrarian society to free market capitalism and a conglomeration of power in the hands of large businesses that were then concentrating the wealth in the hands of the few, while workers lived in poverty and worked under increasingly dangerous conditions. The Communist Manifesto was published in 1848 by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They criticized early ideals of...
I wish people would talk about the bourgeois revolutions that happened more. You know, the bourgeoisie seizing power from the previous owners of society. And I even wish more Marxists understood that. You know, I saw again recently a Marxist criticizing the American Revolution because it was bourgeois and trying to say it wasn't progressive because it was bourgeois. Oh, that, you know, an anti-colonial revolution by the bourgeoisie is progressive, right? Or you know, you could say the Civil War was the bourgeois economy, the capitalist economy, fully kicking out the slave-based economy. That is a progressive step. Sorry, little side rant there. I won't go on another tangent.
Socialism as being unrealistic utopian dreams. Instead, they advocated for a strong central government to control all aspects of economic production and provide its citizens with their basic needs like food, shelter, medical care, and education. Communism was also...
The centralized government doesn't control all aspects of economic production. Like I just said, you have workers' councils and decentralized forms of power that report to the central government.
Sometimes referred to as revolutionary socialism, because Marx and other communist thinkers argued that all of history was, in the end, a history of class struggles. He believed that the working class or proletariat would inevitably triumph through revolutionary struggles over...
And this is where it would be helpful to talk about the bourgeois revolutions that preceded this. So it's not just, you know, socialist revolutions that Marx predicted would come out of nowhere. He's looking at previously existing societies and how they changed with class struggles and with revolutionary struggles.
For the wealthy class or bourgeoisie, gaining control over the means of production and ultimately erasing class distinctions. And this theory was put to the test in Russia during the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the installation of the world's first communist government in the Soviet Union. In the United States around this time, the Socialist Party was seeing its heyday. In the years before World War I, the Socialist Party in the United States claimed 113,000 members, making it one of the largest socialist movements in the world. In the 1912 and 1920 elections, the Socialist Party gained 900,000 votes, most notably for Eugene V. Debs, who was running for president at one point, running from prison. I made a whole separate video about that. In 1919, the party splintered when the communist members split and eventually formed the Communist Party USA. Though their official numbers were smaller, topping out at 66,000 members in 1939, the Communist Party was able to amass 115,000 votes for Senate races in 1940. That all fell apart after World War II. Despite the fact that the United States was briefly allied with Russia to defeat Germany during World War II, immediately after the war, Russia claimed control over much of Eastern Europe instead of reinstating independence to the countries it helped liberate from the Germans, thus forming
No. It is still established socialist control after liberating them from the Germans. Or they kicked the Nazis out and then let these people build their own governments, or, encouraged socialist or revolutionary governments to take control rather than the fascistic governments. And that's what the Soviet invasion of Hungary was, which is originally was how people started getting called tankies, because the Soviet Union went into these a few places to kick out fascist governments that had literally taken power of the government. And the U.S. media kept showing images in the news of the tanks rolling in, the Soviet tanks, and then anybody who supported that was labeled as a tanky. But yeah, just study the governmental system, study the system of democracy that were set up in any of the so-called Soviet satellite states. They had far more democracy than, any Western capitalist country, any country in West Europe, that they could be compared to. And of course, they weren't perfect. None of these countries were, but they had far more democracy than any of the capitalist countries, and they were not Soviet colonies. And in fact, there's a leaked CIA document or CIA report where they said this was a propaganda tactic that they were going to try and use, was accusing the Soviet Union of imperialism to try and conflate what they were doing with what the U.S. was doing, when in fact, of course, the Soviet Union, based on the right to self-determination, the principle of self-determination, was supporting anti-colonial struggles, whether socialist or not, all across the global South. Anti-colonial struggles and independent struggles in Africa and countries like that. So to act like they were the same colonial imperialist superpower that the U.S. was is just CIA version of history.
Right, and it leaves out the fact that what the West was doing after the Second World War was propping up bourgeois governments on the rubble of
fascist governments. Sorry,
right, bourgeois and fascist governments on the rubble of what was left after the Second World War, and it was only as a reaction to that the Soviet Union started getting the countries that were on the east and having the establishment of socialist republics there, where, of course, as you mentioned, people lived and had securities that were much more profound than anywhere else in the West. But it's also important to note that stuff like the Comintern was dissolved in order to prevent the communist threat in various of those Western European countries, and countries like Greece and like Italy that had genuine potentials for communist revolution to succeed. They were pushed back against by the Soviet Union as a sort of I'm losing the word here, but as a compromise to the West, right? So it misses so much of the history. Where if anything, if you're going to critique the socialists and the communist camp for anything, it would be for being too soft on the imperialists and for giving them and their promises too much weight.
For sure.
But what else could they do, right, after the results of the Second World War on the Soviet economy, on Soviet lives and their population? Like, what the fuck else could they do? They couldn't directly wage a fight against Western imperialism right after, especially after the U.S. came out basically unscathed from the Second World War because of how late it went into the game and how little of the fighting it ended up doing. And now you have people in the U.S. wearing fucking shirts that say back-to-back World War champs. I mean, come on, but
that's a facepalm moment. Like, come on, Americans. Yeah, and we compared the Soviet countries to the West European countries. The prototypical example is Germany, because you had East and West Germany. Obviously, the country was split. And as we said, East Germany and the Soviet states weren't perfect. But if you want a comparison, that shows how much better the East German economy was, and the East German efforts at democracy were. Read Victor Grossman, who lived in East Germany at the time. He's heavily critical of the government and of the Stasi, and of things that went on at the time, or the Berlin Wall, things that the socialists were forced to do in order to survive. But he's very clear that the situation in East Germany was better than West Germany in many ways when it came to democracy and economic stability. And that economic stability and democracy just collapsed, with the fall of the Soviet Union, and the country was neoliberalized, and living standards got much, much worse, and political repression got much, much worse for East Germany under capitalism, which is what happened in every single one of these Soviet states, including the ones that, some of the least successful states under socialism still got much, 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 much worse under capitalism.
The USSR. It was in this fallout from World War II that the US obsession with communism took full force. Prior to the Second World War, communists and socialists existed in the United States with some skepticism, especially given the human rights abuses committed by the newly formed Soviet Union. But after the Second World War, the zeitgeist against communism began in full force. This was aided by the founding of the House Un-American Activities Committee. Founded in 1938 to root out Nazi sympathizers in the government, the committee became a central force for rooting out communism in all arms of society, including holding highly publicized hearings targeting Hollywood, leading to the creation of a blacklist and ruining the careers and lives of many budding artists in Hollywood for the next decade. In 1947, President Truman put forth what would become known as the Truman Doctrine, pledging that the United States would help any nation resist communism in order to prevent its spread. This policy was also known as the containment policy. Like, all right, maybe we can't defeat the Russians, but it has to stop with them. We must.
That's such an insane anti-democratic policy, a policy that goes against everything that the U.S. claims to be about in our Constitution. It's an anti-constitutional policy. Just like my, dad was saying when he's getting more political, but when he was apolitical, he's like, wait, we can go into these countries and drop bombs on them because they want to be socialist? I thought we supported democracy, like the illogic of it. It's amazing that so many people were brainwashed into this, but yeah.
Contain communism at all costs. That same year, Truman signed Executive Order 9835, which provided the FBI with broad powers to investigate federal employees for potential security risks, aka communist sympathizers and spies sending information to the Soviets. And also in 1947, Truman created the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and quickly began using the new agency's covert activities to promote his containment theory. Then in 1949, the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb, and the United States was like, oh no, we're supposed to be the only ones capable of ending life on Earth with the push of a button, boo. And then a few months later, the Chinese Communist Party officially declared victory in the Chinese Civil War that had been raging since 1927. So much for containment. This led to increased fear that secret communists.
Shout out to the Rosenbergs, who were the ones that filtered the information on how to make the nukes to the Soviets. They're celebrated as heroes in Cuba. My parents used to go to the rallies with everyone else celebrating the Rosenbergs, and one of the moments that has brought the most that I've been the most proud of, and that my parents have been the most proud of, was when one of my articles that was published in Monthly Review, the son of the Rosenbergs ended up emailing my department, my philosophy department in school, and looking for a way to get in contact with me to congratulate me on my article. And I established contact with them, and were able to publish some of their stuff on Midwestern Marx. But I remember telling my dad, my parents, and they're like, holy shit, like we used to go out from the time we were little kids to celebrate the Rosenbergs because they literally saved the world. They balanced the global forces and allowed the socialist camp to have, the necessary means to prevent the full-on attack of the empire, which unfortunately, but realistically, means that if you have nukes, you're not going to get fucked with in the same way that if you don't have nukes. So
absolutely. And denuclearization is pushed pretty hard in liberal societies, but what the US means by that is all of our enemies has to denuclearize. We can keep them though. And our buddy James Ray, who used to not be a fan of Midwestern Marx and used to have some liberal tendencies, but like a year or two ago had a real shift towards being a staunch Marxist-Leninist, and he made a TikTok arguing in favor of nuclear weapons for countries like the DPRK and he got a lot of shit from that, even from people who liked him. So solidarity with James, and he made a great TikTok video about why communists shouldn't support denuclearization. Makes the point that look at what happened to Libya. Libya gave up their nuclear program. NATO invaded. The DPRK has nukes. NATO hasn't been able to invade.
Within the United States government had been spying for the Soviets, sending them bomb-making secrets and thwarting communications that could have enabled the U.S. to ward off the communist victory in China. And it was in this national atmosphere, just ripe with fear, that Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy burst onto the scene in February of 1950 at what was supposed to be a...
Boo! Making Wisconsin look bad. Hold on.
You suck! You suck!
low-profile speech in the small town of Wheeling, West Virginia, McCarthy waved a sheet of paper in the air, proclaiming to the audience, "I have here in my hand a list of 205 names that were made known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party, and who, nevertheless, are still working and shaping U.S. policy." It was later revealed that he didn't actually have a list, and when pressed for names, he waffled, saying he actually had 57 names, and then saying he had 81 names, and then finally promising that he definitely had at least one name for one communist in the government. But even though his evidence was shaky at best, that didn't matter. He had lit the flame, fanned by fear and paranoia of what would become known as the Red Scare. Throughout the early 1950s, American leaders regularly told the public to be fearful of the subversive influence of communism in their lives. Communists could be lurking anywhere, on college campuses, in labor unions, among artists and journalists, in your children's school. Boo! Senator McCarthy capitalized on this paranoia, launching a series of highly publicized probes into alleged communist penetration into all arms of the government: the State Department, the White House, the Treasury, the Army. At the University of California, 31 professors were dismissed in 1950 for refusing to sign a loyalty oath. The Senate Internal Security Act mandated that all communist organizations had to register with the government, giving the Senate greater power to investigate potential communists for sedition and revoking or barring citizenship to suspected communists. This anti-communist fervor played out in courtrooms as well. In 1950, a couple named Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were indicted on charges of giving nuclear secrets to the Russians. Julius had worked briefly at the U.S. Army Signal Corps Laboratory in New Jersey, where he had access to classified information. He and his wife Ethel had also...
I just want to say the fact that some of this stuff passed through our legal system, and that this was just openly the policy of the U.S. government at the time, that you're not allowed to be communist and we'll go to war with any country who becomes communist. It shows how liberalism always fails to live up to its own ideals, right? When you critique liberalism, liberals go, well, how could you argue against freedom of speech and freedom of political expression? Like, well, because liberal societies never, ever, 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 ever live up to those ideals. Right, a Marxist analysis of these societies tells us much more about how they work. Right, when you have a superstructure, a legal and political system that is conditioned by and create the economics of society. So you have the ruling capitalist class, the legal system, and the political system, and the military comes to be controlled by them and fight for their interests. So you have a legal system that makes being communist essentially illegal, and a political system that says we'll invade any communist country. No, it's not in line with any of the ideals of liberalism, but it's completely in line with the interests of the capitalist ruling class. So the Marxist analysis of legal systems and political systems tells us much more about liberalism than what the ideals of liberalism tell us about itself.
Been members of the American Communist Party in the 1930s. Based on evidence that was shaky at best, Ethel and Julius were found guilty in 1951 of espionage under Section 2 of the Espionage Act of 1917, which stated that anyone found guilty of transmitting information related to national defense to a foreign country could be imprisoned for life or put to death. In June 1953, both Ethel and Julius were executed via the electric chair. Several decades later, evidence came out that definitively showed Julius, but not Ethel, had given information to the Soviet Union. If the Espionage Act of 1917 sounds familiar, that's because it's the same law that Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, and more recently, the former president of the United States, Donald J. Trump, have all been accused or charged with violating. The Rosenbergs remain the only people put to death for espionage during peacetime in the United States. The FBI continued to fan the flames of the Red Scare by assisting in the production of blatant anti-communist propaganda films and television shows, including The Red Menace in 1949, My Son John in 1951, and I Led Three Lives that ran from them.
And honestly, like, this girl is probably not. I mean, probably not. She's not a communist. She's probably against communist countries. But when it comes to like the position she's taking as an American, they're objectively on our side. If she's against like U.S. meddling in the affairs of of countries that have decided to take the communist and socialist route. She's on our side, a hell of a lot more than the so-called democratic socialists, who vote in favor of sending billions of dollars to Nazis and who agree with all of the sanctions regimes that we're putting on socialist countries, or who at least are indifferent to it. At least she's making a very well edited video about how it is that the U.S. has fucked with countries that have decided through their own right to self-determination to go down the socialist route, and in a way kind of implying the hypocrisy that's present in our actions when we do that.
It reminds me of RFK. And like we said, liberalism never lives up to its own ideals, but there are still sort of classical liberals, like maybe this lady or RFK, who want liberalism to live up to its ideals, who are honest about our current system and realize it's a inept, corrupt, militaristic dictatorship that really is controlled by the military industrial complex and a handful of large corporations and finance capitalists. So they're critical of the American security state and the wars and the pharmaceutical industry. And, you know, it's important to find alliances in these places, and, you know, also recognize the kind of support that a message like that can galvanize. I mean, like what RFK is doing right now. We just got to re-articulate people's consciousnesses towards socialism, towards Marxism.
1953 to 1956. In these films, as well as in other government propaganda and fear-mongering, anti-communism was aligned with U.S. pride over patriotism, religious conviction, and an unflinching faith in the promise of capitalism and the American dream. These were embedded in the U.S. consciousness, along with anti-communism, as undeniably American values. And anything that didn't align with these values was viewed with suspicion. The paranoia led to a rigid enforcement of conformity, and any behavior considered deviant was seen as dangerous. Women who had taken an important place in the workforce during World War II were told to leave their jobs and go back to the home where they belong. Black people were told to conform to the American social order after fighting and dying for their country. Being gay, which was already stigmatized, became dangerous, as any personal secrets could potentially expose you to blackmail. Many anti-communists, including...
We wrote an article about that, or our friend Jimmy did, in the Journal of American Socialist Studies 1, about the persecution of gay communists who were targeted because they were gay, because they were communists and because they were gay, but the fact that they were gay was utilized by the ruling class to smear them and attack them and out them to their families and communities at a time when it wasn't widely accepted. So a hint of lavender by our buddy Jimmy, who I don't know if he's in the stream today. He's a pretty consistent viewer and writer for Midwestern Marx, but yeah, that's a great article. I just wanted to shout out. Thank you so much, Chaya, for the super chat. Really, 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 really appreciate that. Got like 8 super chats today. So thank you all so much for supporting our project financially. Have you ever read one of those ex-CPUSA snitch memoirs like Witness by Whittaker Chambers or School of Darkness by Bella Todd? Thoughts? I have not. Be very interesting to check them out, though, and maybe I will later on, because as someone in CPUSA, that sounds very interesting to me. So thank you.
Senator McCarthy believed that gay men were morally weak and were therefore particularly predisposed to betraying their country, and that lesbians and gay men could be easily blackmailed by Soviet agents because of their deviant sexual behavior. Not only that, but religion, and most importantly Christianity, became a central bulwark for warding off impending communist doom. McCarthy described the anti-communist movement as an all-out battle between communistic atheism and Christianity. Religious conservatives pushed for the traditional nuclear God-fearing family to protect against the spread of atheistic communism, which was often conflated with totalitarian.
I know she's a liberal, but, you know, to use the words of the youth, I mean, it's based what she's saying. You know, it's she's debunking these artificial and fake sort of bifurcations that are created by the State Department and McCarthyism.
So I came.
It's literally you know, even part of how we phrase things. Like, McCarthyism makes people try to believe that you have America on this side and quote-unquote American values on this side, and then there's an unbridgeable gulf between that and communism on the other side. And communism is anti-Americanism. And we've developed this critique into how certain parts of the communist left end up accepting that and participating in a form of left-wing McCarthyism. But you know, it's, I know she's a liberal, not a communist, but effectively through what she's saying, like, it's true, and a lot of it is true, and it helps us overcome a lot of these wrongful assumptions. And how many views does this video have, by the way? We usually react to stuff with a few hundreds of thousands of views. Oh, you're muted.
234,000.
Oh, that's not bad.
Not as many as some of the videos we react to, but yeah, it's too based. The YouTube algorithm probably sensed that it was too commie and suppressed it. Someone sent this in Discord. That was how we got it.
Imperialism after the war. Public displays of religiosity became a prime way in which Americans sought to differentiate themselves from what they considered to be atheist communism. The Pledge of Allegiance was altered to include the words "One Nation Under God" in 1954. "In God We Trust" was adopted as the official national motto.
It was written by a socialist Christian from Florida, by the way. The Pledge of Allegiance. So that's a fun fact.
In 1956, and one of the most popular films of the decade was The Ten Commandments, which retold the story of Exodus as a Cold War parable. Through this paranoia and propaganda, communism became
written by Biggie Smalls, by the way. It's a wonderful movie.
linked with amorality, and the idea of fighting communism was permanently implanted in the American psyche as inherently moral, Christian, patriotic, and the ultimate show of being a true American. And the internal fight to root out communism from all facets of American life mirrored and was often overshadowed by external conflicts to further the initial doctrine of containment that President Truman declared at the end of World War II. I can't give you an exhaustive retelling of the many strings.
Super patriotism, exactly. And they called the communists, American hating people who want to destroy your way of life and take away your toothbrush and blah, blah, blah. And, it's almost like a lot of leftists today have internalized McCarthyism. They're like, yeah, I literally hate America and everybody living in it. It's not that I want to sublate the country and turn it into something new and better and put it on a path of construction. I just want to destroy it. I just want the country to crumble and everyone in it to suffer, which is anti-Marxist. I don't even know what you would call that. Just defeatist doomerism, Marxist or Maoism, third worldism, I guess, is the closest ideology you could lump it in with. But yeah, there's a reason that Joseph McCarthy and the ruling class spent so much time, money, and energy pushing that kind of idea that to be patriotic is to support U.S. imperialism and capitalism. And the communists are anti-patriotic and want to destroy everything that you hold dear. So it's important to reject that narrative and say, no, as communists, we want to give you a better life. We want to improve your standard of living. We want to make the government one that serves you, the working class Americans, rather than corporate America, which every American in the country knows the government serves corporate America at this point.
That the U.S. pulled internationally in its fight against communism, because we ain't got the time, but also because I can guarantee you that there's a lot we simply don't know. But let me give you a smattering of examples so you can get a feel for it, because if anti-communism inside America seemed messy, boy howdy was it a catastrophe abroad. In June 1950, the North Korean army invaded South Korea, bringing to fruition the United States' biggest fears and the reason for the containment doctrine. The United Nations and the United States quickly sent troops over to try to push the North Koreans back and keep South Korea from falling to communist rule. Over the course of 3 bloody years, the border between North and South Korea moved dramatically. When the war ended in a truce in 1953, 36,000 American servicemen were dead, and the border between North and South Korea remained largely unchanged from before the war. In 1950, the same year as the start of the Korean War, Jacobo Arbenz was democratically elected to the presidency of Guatemala. He wasn't a communist, but he was backed by all the leftist parties in the country. Arbenz was committed to what he termed modernization in Guatemala. The main initiative he launched during his presidency was a major agrarian reform bill. As part of that bill, any mass ownership of land where most of the land was not being cultivated would be bought back from the landowners using government bonds and then given to the local peasants to cultivate. Arbenz proposed this bill, and the democratically elected parliament passed it. But here's the pesky thing about land reform. The people with a lot of land really don't like it. And they often have a lot of money to fight it. Ever heard of United Fruit Company? By 1950, the United Fruit Company was the largest landowner and employer in...
I'm wondering how this fits in, because Arbenz wasn't communist or even socialist, and all he wanted to do was take the land that United Fruit Company wasn't using productively and give it to the peasants or the people so that they could use it productively. So just because he wanted to take the unused land and redistribute it, the Dulles brothers, one of whom was actually a shareholder or a member of United Fruit, and the other was the head of the CIA at the time, really pushed for this coup against Arbenz. And this is where the U.S. started claiming that anybody who accused the CIA of being involved in this was a conspiracy theorist. This is the first time they pulled out that little tactic that they're still using today of calling everyone a conspiracy theorist that criticizes U.S. imperialism.
And that was overseen by Edward Bernays, who oversaw the propaganda in order to ensure that consent was given for our operations in Latin America, specifically in Guatemala.
In Guatemala. They also made an annual profit of $65 million, which was twice the revenue of the government of Guatemala. And higher ups in the United Fruit Company, they knew that the Americans hated the communists, so they started doing a little lobbying. The company spent $500,000 on convincing United States lawmakers and civilians that Arbenz needed to be overthrown. But it wasn't just powerful lobbying, no. While the United States was freaked out about communists infiltrating the government, they were perfectly fine with private interests infiltrating every aspect of government operations. Attorney John Foster Dulles had represented the United Fruit Company as their attorney. In 1950, he was the U.S. Secretary of State. His brother, Alan Dulles, was the director of the CIA. Alan also sat on the board of directors of the United
Holy cow. I called it.
Fruit Company. In 1953, Eisenhower authorized the CIA operation to overthrow the government of Jacobo Arbenz. News of this operation was leaked to the Arbenz government, who accused the United States of preparing to overthrow a democratically elected president. The U.S. flatly denied the allegations and accused Arbenz of falling victim to communist propaganda, which the media and American people ate right up. By 1954, Arbenz was badly in need of weapons because the United States had started blocking arms sales to Guatemala in 1951. So he secretly bought weapons from Czechoslovakia, which of course was then immediately portrayed by the U.S. government as Soviet interference and the establishment of a new communist stronghold right in our own backyard. And that was all the CIA needed to officially launch its coup. By June of
And what this shows too is that it's not necessarily the ideology of communism that drives imperialism. It's the economics of it. It's production, right? Arbenz wasn't a communist or a socialist. He just wanted to redistribute land, but they smeared him as a communist and a socialist to justify regime change. Right. And the reason they don't like the ideology of communism is because they know that leads to land redistribution, that leads to a change in production where the working class can take control, and therefore the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, loses control. So it's production that drives these things, not necessarily the ideology of communism. That would be maybe the one flaw with her analysis there, or the one thing I think she should point out.
1954. Realizing he had lost the support of his army and his people, Arbenz formally resigned the presidency. In the power vacuum left by the coup, a military junta took control of the country, eventually installing Carlos Castillo Armas, a member of the right-wing National Liberation Movement, who created an authoritarian government that was closely allied with the United States. He was also the first of numerous authoritarian rulers.
Fun fact, Che Guevara was in Guatemala when this went down. He was hiding in one of the embassies, taking shelter. And the U.S. knew that the communists would have been scattered and, fleeing once the Castillo Armas coup was in action because they didn't want to die. And they told Castillo Armas to massacre everybody who was hiding in the embassies. They just wanted him to kill everyone, Pinochet style, just round up all the communists and execute them. But Castillo Armas wouldn't because he was afraid that it would cause an insurrection against him. Che Guevara lived, went on to lead a revolution in Cuba, and the U.S. would go on to be much more murderous in their regime change efforts and commit many, many massacres, probably trying to not make the same mistake again of letting a revolutionary escape from under their nose.
In Guatemala, whose reversal of Arbenz's reforms led to the Guatemalan Civil War, which lasted from 1960 to 1996. In 1960, the Republic of Congo declared its independence from Belgian rule and held its first.
So now she's just going to go through a bunch of the coups that the U.S. did and justified by saying it was to contain communism. But
in each case,
pretty good video.
In each case, it's important to note, and she doesn't fully do that. Of course, she's being very brief, but it's important to note the immense amount of people that die, not just communists and activists and organizers against the existing fascistic U.S. propped up regimes, but also just regular indigenous people. I read this book in undergrad, Legoetam, which is the sort of tales of an indigenous woman whose father ended up becoming a communist in the struggles against the coup government that was propped up by the U.S. after the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz, and just the life that indigenous people had to endure. It was like living under, a terroristic form of it was just horrific, just completely horrific. Any semblance of like democratic rights were stripped, and just you listen to the accounts of like their lives, and all that you can connect it to is like the life of people in concentration camps in Nazi Germany. It was just completely horrific, and that's the reality that the U.S. would impose in a lot of Latin America in order to prevent what they called the communism, which was usually just like, let's like not have American multinational corporations exploit the shit out of our people and extract all of our resources so they can get rich and we stay poor. Which I guess that's, aligned with the communists, but, a lot of the time it wasn't like communist parties coming to power.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, what did the Nazis want to do is, take over all of Europe and Asia and basically make it a colony for the German master race. What has the U.S. done with the global South? And Germany was perpetrating a genocide. How many genocidal, attacks has the U.S. carried out, or murder campaigns like Operation Condor in Latin America, putting Pinochet in power? The Jakarta method in Indonesia, millions upon millions of people massacred for their political ideology by a country that claims to stand for freedom, democracy, and free speech. So yeah. I think to end our stream today, we should watch one of these old anti-communist propaganda videos. Our friend Jacob made a TikTok reacting to one that I remember being pretty funny. So these are always hilarious. I think these are even funnier than like Reefer Madness, than like the anti-cannabis or anti-pot propaganda commercials from back in the day. Except I guess these are a little more nefarious because they had such a horrible effect on the American consciousness. But
so I came across this.
I guess I'm going to turn it down a bit. I guess the weed propaganda helped perpetrate the war on drugs and the prison industrial complex. So they're both bad.
Cold War era anti-communist propaganda film, and I'm going to watch it. I'm going to subject myself to capitalist dogma.
One day it will be your mission to destroy those bourgeois capitalist freedoms.
Already they're making communists out to be comic book villains.
The courses here in this strangest of all schools. Espionage as a science.
What the fuck?
Baseball game. Hot dogs.
Oh no, not the hot dogs.
Socialism is when no hot dogs, no iPhone, and no butthole meat.
Freedom and You. Brought to you by the U.S. Department of Defense.
I remember that Russian town we saw earlier.
Oh, you mean that Russian town where everyone speaks English? Now, it wouldn't be the 50s if we weren't clearly shown that the husband and wife sleep in 2 separate beds.
They were good. Come on, comrade.
Oh yeah, because every single one of us communists refer to each other as comrade.
You are now prepared for the next step of your indoctrination.
What? Am I just watching a comic book story come to life?
Which one is giving the children? The meals that be consumed without interruption.
We learned in school that home life does not encourage the growth of the collective character which the party wishes to develop in its young people.
Based.
What kids talk like this? They literally look like that they're reading off of cue cards.
You better listen to me, all of you. I don't want to hear any more talk about state schools and party lines and collective character.
No more state schools, like the public schools in America.
Yeah, no freedom of thought and expression.
You two are going to send Sunday school. You're going right now.
You're going to be indoctrinated into the church and you're going to love it.
Everything on this table is as phony as a town. The rotten system you call communism. Who says I'm guilty of anything? What's your proof? State needs no proof. It's up to you to prove your innocence. Proof is one word you don't use. It's one word you fear.
What is it? Freedom?
That word is freedom.
Fucking called it.
People were asking about what communist justice is earlier. It's when the state can accuse you of anything and you're guilty until proven innocent. There it is. That's what the world Karl Marx wanted.
What you have seen is not entirely fiction.
Yes, it is. As suspected, this film sucks, and this guy is just another capitalist cuck.
It was an hour and a half of that, Jacob? Jeez. I thought it was just a commercial. It's a whole ass movie. That's rough. I hope you watched it on fast forward or something.
That's self-induced torture right there, man. I wouldn't be able to do that. Although there's some masterpieces, masterpieces that I think all people should watch. And I've just recently watched them, like Gone with the Wind. It's so cringy because of how racist, frankly racist, a big chunk of it is. But it's still a cinematic masterpiece, and it tells you a lot about the culture of like the southern United States in the antebellum and then post-war period. But yeah, watching those deeply anti-communist films that are just done for the sake of propaganda is it's kind of unbearable.
I mean, you bring up Gone with the Wind. The ultimate example of that is Birth of a Nation,
Birth of a
which
Nation,
was
yes.
literally created by the KKK, but had groundbreaking filmmaking techniques that were copied afterwards. And the American Film Institute, I think that's what it is, AFI, did like a top 100 American movies of all time list, and they had Birth of a Nation like top 20. And then people were like, that was made by the KKK, and then they redid the list and took it out of there. But yeah, kind of an interesting. You separate the art from the artist. I mean, probably not in that case because it's literally a movie about the KKK, like fighting off the evil black criminals. It's pretty disgusting to watch nowadays, but
it is. Yeah, I still haven't been able to get through it. I started watching it and it was uncomfortable, so I haven't finished it. But I mean, I know comrades who've been able to see it and recognize its artistic value while seeing how dog shit the ideology is. And there's so many instances of that historically. Like Balzac was Engels' favorite writer, and in terms of literature, a genius, but he was a deeply conservative writer, somewhat akin to like Thomas Carlyle and Wagner, the great German composer. You know, try to top that in terms of classical music. And he was a Nazi anti-Semite, or you know, a deeply anti-Semitic dude. And so yeah, this idea that you can't separate the artist from the art, I don't know. I think there's a question that we should be asking instead, which is, can deeply flawed people produce something beautiful? And that's another question. And it's not about. It's almost like what Kant does in his Prolegomena to the Future of Any Metaphysics. At some point, you have to ask, like, it's not a question of can they, but you have proof that they can. Like Wagner's compositions are beautiful, and the question is how. How is this the case? How can people who are so fucked up and hold on to such fucked up beliefs produce something aesthetically beautiful? You know, you can't just brush off the contradictions by saying that. And I haven't seen it, so maybe I'll see it and I'll be like, yeah, Gone with the Wind, not Gone with the Wind. Birth of a Nation doesn't deserve to be up there, so I can't comment on it. But you can't just brush off the thing and say, yeah, because it's this, we're not going to include it. You have to tarry with that contradiction. How can such a ideologically fucked thing be at the same time beautiful from another angle?
And on that note, we'll be ending this stream with a song from Kanye West.
How could you be so heartless?
Just kidding. But that's all for our stream today, y'all. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much to our moderators, Jacob, Cobra Commander, Ware Pilgrim. Maybe Unparalleled Dev was in here. I don't know. Any other. Thank you to all the super chatters. Thank you to everyone who participated in the chat. Appreciate the crap out of you all. Patreon.com/MidwesternMarx is where you can support us financially. Yeah, what else do we got coming up? Call for Papers is out for the Journal of American Socialist Studies 3. Got a book project coming out. And yeah, anything else that I'm missing?
Oh, the publishing press is popping. So we hopefully by next week we'll have Tom Riggins' commentary on Engels' Ludwig Feuerbach out, and we have so many manuscripts that we're finishing up that we're kind of stretching ourselves thin, but it's all tremendously important work, and we're hoping to have at least 4 more publications by the end of the year. But yeah, it's a lot of work, and we're adding more editors onto the team, more people that can help the oversight on that end, and getting better at streamlining the process. So we'll be better at putting out more stuff with more frequency. But look out for our publishing press. We're going to be publishing a hell of a lot more. We're going to have more schools coming up. Danny Shaw's school should be coming up within the next few weeks or within the next month. We'll hopefully try to line it up with the beginning of the fall semester so people can feel like it's a university course. But very exciting stuff. Noah's class is coming to a conclusion. I think he's got maybe 3 to 4 weeks left. He'll have people turn in papers at the end, so we'll publish those on a part of the website. So yeah, a lot of developments with the Institute, and we might have a big fundraiser, somewhat soon. We're still trying to decide the details of it, but yeah, a lot of exciting stuff coming up for the Midwestern Marx Institute, the People's Institute. So
a lot to look forward to. All right, y'all. We'll actually play out with a song. This is Uncle Lucius, Keep the Wolves Away. This is a recommendation from Carlos today. Hope you like it.
It's a good song that describes the process of a working class man who's hurt in the job, because we know that working class people, you always have to understand about the working class as also an environmental proletariat. They work in the worst conditions and are affected in terms of health. And from the beginning of Marx and Engels' writings, you have that specifically with Engels and the conditions of the working class in England. He shows how the conditions in which they do their work affects their health. So we're going to look at someone whose health is affected by their work, and then the child has to take up the mantle of helping the family after the disability.
This is copyrighted, Carlos.
Oh shit!
It's Vivo. Anything that's Vivo, they're gonna take down instantly.
Oh,
let me see if I can find a live performance.
Okay, yeah. So just in case you can find a live performance, it's an interesting story, and we had someone comment a couple streams ago that something similar happened to them. Their parents had health issues because of their work, and eventually the disability ran out, and they were like, what the fuck, how are we going to survive now? And the kid had to take up the task of working at a very young age and sustaining the family. And it's a reality that so many poor working class American people have experienced.
Absolutely. All right. Enjoy the live version here. We'll see y'all next time.
Compelling story as well, and I think it hits home with people that are in the grind. You hear that story all the time, blue collar in the grind and just barely making it, and especially these days.
Took my first breath where the muddy brazos spills into the Gulf of Mexico, where the skyline is colored by chemical plants to put bread on the table of the working man, where the working man does his best to provide safety and shelter for kids and a wife, giving a little of his soul every day, making overtime to keep the wolves away. I was barely 13 when the company man tried to dig my daddy's grave. It happened on a French-owned tanker ship, spilling poison in the Galveston Bay, where the liquid fire filled his lungs and his eyes silenced any more cries. Cold in the grip, death stinging pain, he fought like hell to keep the wolves away. For the next few years, Dad was sick as a dog, but he made a recovery just despite the odds. Settlement came and we moved out of town, where the sky isn't heavy with refinery clouds. Yeah, he's still alive, he's doing good, he's in his 50s, but the money's running out and he's pinching for pennies. So I'm going for broke with every song I play, 'cause now it's my turn to keep the wolves away.